This session today is based upon a module I teach in the second year. It's a skills module in which we as a department think about particular skills, sources and methodologies. The skills, sources and methodologies utilised by professional historians in their research. And my particular module considers sound as a primary historical source. So, historians, as you know, utilise a whole range of different types of written sources to study the past, in addition to other types of sources like images, moving images, perhaps oral history interviews, perhaps landscape and buildings. All these can be used as sources and read as sources, as it were. But I think it's my contention in that module that historians don't necessarily listen to the past quite as much as they read the past, that they don't draw upon different instances, different examples of recorded sounds and listen to the past to try to understand any period under consideration. So in the case of my module, on which this session is based, we take the civil rights movement as a kind of case study to try to think about the methodological issues involved in listening to the past. We utilise songs, of course, and that will be the topic of this session today, but we also listen to speeches, to sermons, to recordings of protest marches and demonstrations and meetings, even comedy routines done by African-American artists and comedians during the 1970s are drawn upon. Trying to work out what we can get from listening to these oral sources. And we're going to do a little bit of that in this session today, but it is going to be more about the uses of music and songs in particular then in that civil rights movement. So that's the point and that's the aim of this session, and that's the context from which it comes. Hopefully that is useful to you then. Okay then, so as I say, this is about songs, a weapon in the battle, thinking about the uses of music in the civil rights movement. I'm sure you all are very aware of the Black Lives Matter movement that has been in existence since 2013. I'm sure you have a recollection that originated as a result of the failure to convict George Zimmerman for his killing of Trayvon Martin previously in 2012. And I'm sure you've been aware of these other kinds of incidents that have happened since that time that have given further momentum to that Black Lives Matter movement in America. I'm also sure you're very, very aware of more recent developments and the extent to which that movement has been globalised just last year following the death of George Floyd, and the extent to which it has appeared in other countries as well, including here in Great Britain. There on the right you'll see an image from Bristol, of course, which I'm sure is very familiar to you, when that infamous statue then in Bristol was torn down by protesters and then thrown into the dock as a protest against the apparent celebration of this individual involved in the British slave trade. Now, one thing I think that is quite interesting about this development in America in the last decade or so is the way in which a number of different artists, musical artists, have reflected on these kinds of issues, have commented upon them within their work, the ways in which their music has been turned to think about these kinds of issues then. So you can see there that I've named a number of different artists that have reflected on the Black Lives Matter movement and the various issues that it addresses in their work, and I'm sure you can think of a great many others as well. Perhaps some of you will recognise some of these two stills from a music video. That, of course, is Kendrick Lamar, who has addressed these kinds of issues in some of his songs. And very interestingly, his song All Right has been taken up by protesters within that movement and then utilised in the various protests, marches and demonstrations that they've undertaken in different towns and cities right across America. Perhaps you've seen this on the news, perhaps you've seen examples of this on YouTube. But here is one example of that taking place, and as you can see, back in 2016. I'll just play a short excerpt from this.
Come out!
Now, that kind of use, that instrumental use of music and of songs is not new. This is nothing new at all, in recent decades. This is a tradition that goes back many years, many decades. Indeed, it goes back many centuries. Songs have had a very important place within African and then African American culture, perhaps in a way different to Western culture, where music is something that you go somewhere to consume, to listen to, perhaps in a courteous kind of manner. Songs in an African kind of tradition before slavery, and then in an African American tradition in the more recent past, have been used in quite functional kinds of ways then as part of everyday life. And we can see this very, very clearly in that civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, indeed into the 1970s as well. But we're going to focus on the 50s and 60s to a kind of significant degree then in this session, and think about the ways in which songs have been were used in that movement during that period. Indeed, it was very, very obvious to observers at the time that songs were playing a very important part in that civil rights movement at that time. This, as you can see, is a New York Times article that gives this session its title. It described the civil rights movement as a great singing movement. It recognised the extent and the importance of those songs in this pursuit then of justice and equality. As you can see from the quotation from that article, the songs, old and new, are used at mass meetings, demonstrations, prayer vigils, on freedom rides, in jails and before sit-ins. So, this was immediately obvious to everybody at that time. It was a great singing movement. And it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Songs as a weapon in some sort of political battle to effect change. Are songs that powerful? Can songs bring about change? Can they change attitudes and so on? Certainly the different members of the civil rights movement thought so. It recognised this at the time. As you can see, it set up its own singing groups in order for songs to be performed within the different contexts of this movement. So there you see on the left, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee set up their own group, the SNCC Freedom Singers, that attended its different kinds of meetings and demonstrations and performed different types of songs. Now, that was a very mainstream kind of organisation, very much founded upon, based upon the Black Church at that time, enlisting students for the most part in this campaign. Starting out with a kind of non-violent philosophy, but shifting towards kind of more black nationalism by the mid-1960s. The other kind of example I've given here is the Black Panther Party setting up its own singing group as well. This is far less well known than are the Freedom Singers, but nevertheless it's interesting to see these different organisations within the movement themselves setting up these singing groups and recognising the role that songs could play in their activities. So that, I think, is really, really interesting. Connected to that, recognising the power of these songs, and indeed of this kind of oral culture, the movement actually recorded all manner of different aspects of this culture, put those recordings on records, and then disseminated and sold them as broadly as they possibly could. So there's a few good examples there. These were all recorded and then released there in the 1960s. So the first, you can see the Nashville Sit-In Story. That's a collection of different types of recordings, songs, yes, but also excerpts from interviews with participants, sermons and political speeches and so on. And these other recordings reflected other aspects. So the freedom rides and the sit-ins, they most definitely had their particular songs that were being used, and of course interviewees who were taking part in those things. And then, the Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1963 and 1964, their activities there in voter registration, again, collected together in this album that was released and sold and of course bought then by people across America at that time, and are of course available to us as primary historical sources to study this movement. Just as an aside, these 3 albums and others very much like them, all of them recorded by Folkways Records, as perhaps you can see from the covers there. They're all available to you on YouTube, so look them up. They are fantastic sources, and they really do give a good insight, I think, into the movement during that period. One song in particular came to characterise that movement. We Shall Overcome, as you can see there, was an old song. It had been utilised by the labour movement back in the 1940s. Came to be adapted then by Guy Carwan in 1959 for use in the civil rights movement. So a different tune is used, the words are changed slightly, and it comes to be performed in a very different way to what had been the case with the trade union campaigners beforehand. But nevertheless, this could be heard during so many different meetings at that time. Traditionally, a meeting would end with everybody singing We Shall Overcome. And I've got a short excerpt here to illustrate that.
In the process of working throughout the South and going to jail and getting beat and being in mass meetings and singing, there's one particular song that became the theme song of this movement. It is a powerful song. You can go anywhere in the world today where there is struggle, and you will find this song, and you will still see people in the streets marching and singing it. It is our gift to the world people in struggle. We want to ask you to stand up and cross your right hand over left and sing with us, We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome.
It's a very stirring song, isn't it? And like many of the other songs in the civil rights movement, it was a very simple song. It's easy to pick it up, it's easy to sing along to it, which of course then lent itself to these kinds of contexts then the protesters found themselves in. As I say, this became the anthem of that civil rights movement and could be heard again and again in these different demonstrations. So I'm going to stop at this point and ask you, why do you think that songs were so important in that movement? What role do you think they might have performed? Do you think that singing can and did make a difference? Is this metaphor of songs as a weapon in the battle, a good metaphor to use in this context, do you think?
A comment here from Sarah. I think it gave a collective identity to protesters. Lucy says, I would say less a weapon, more a tool for rallying a crowd or a community in order to create a louder voice for change. Nia's saying songs come from the heart. Ashton says, I think singing together can help build community and give hope, so they could go on for longer. Yeah.
Yeah, those are fantastic answers. Those are exactly the kinds of things that these protesters, these organisers recognised in songs and drew upon. And it's possible to read so much testimony from the participants in these protests, telling you about the psychological kind of effect of these songs on themselves and on each other around them during these demonstrations. Quite interestingly, the lyrics of these songs are changed for different places and different times, and so quite often the names of, the chief of police who is, harassing the protesters, he might be named and in the songs and challenged, or else a governor in that state who again is against desegregation might be called out. So there's a challenging going on. But I think the most interesting kinds of examples of this kind of commentary on the use of these songs is from people who faced, quite significant police violence, who faced dogs, or else felt isolated within jails. Raising one's voice, singing with others, singing and being answered by others gave you courage. It gave you that confidence then to face the very considerable threats that faced you. And so, this was all recognised then and drawn upon in this civil rights movement, and songs used in this instrumental way then to further the cause being pursued here. So I think that is really, really interesting. And yes, that most definitely comes through in your comments, I think. So thank you very much. Lots of different songs were sung. The song we just heard, of course, came from the labour movement, adapted slightly then for this new civil rights context, and other songs also came from the labour movement. In other instances, old slave spirituals from a century and more before were drawn into use in the civil rights movement, and here's one of them here, Wade in the Water. Wade in the Water was one of these very important spirituals that was sung a great many times within these different protests. Wade in the Water, perhaps you know, was a kind of code song for slaves during the time of slavery, giving advice to escaped slaves from plantations, possibly being pursued by bloodhounds, to wade in the water in order to throw off the scent from these bloodhounds chasing them. So it was a kind of code song then to give that kind of advice, that practical advice, disguised behind this kind of religious song that references Moses in the book of Exodus and the flight then from slavery in Egypt. And in these kinds of songs, it's worth pointing out that the flight from slavery is one of obvious kind of relevance to slaves in that particular time, but also that because it's a code song, it's giving you some practical advice. And here, for example, Moses was often the code name for Harriet Tubman, one of the leaders in the Underground Railroad, that network of sympathisers and safe houses then that tried to smuggle escaped slaves from southern states to the northern states or else to Canada. So there's lots going on here. And civil rights protesters in the 1950s and 1960s knew the significance of these songs, and so we're now singing them again in this civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So it's drawing upon the kind of political and radical traditions then of these slave spirituals. Now, those kinds of songs obviously came from African American traditions, whether it be slavery, whether it be the gospel traditions from the 1930s, 40s and 50s, all of them sort of based within the African American church. But what we start to see from the early 1960s, and especially from the middle years of the 1960s, are African-American artists involved in the music industry themselves turning their attention to the movement and the various issues that it addressed in their work. So here, as you can see, Nina Simone is one of the earliest and one of the most prominent, and a very, very strong kind of campaign now through her music for racial justice. There, for example, you can see one of her collections, Forever Young, Gifted and Black, and that title gives a sense of the kind of ideas and spirit and feeling that comes through in that album and in her work. Songs of Freedom and Spirit. Again, an attempt then to inspire, to spread certain kinds of messages, to encourage people to aspire for something better than segregation and racism and so on. So Nina Simone is one very good example of this. Another kind of big star, increasingly big star in the early 1960s, who did turn his attention to the civil rights movement to some degree, at least early on in his career, was Bob Dylan. Now he was coming from, he is a white folk singer, he was a folk singer at that time. And he was drawing upon the kind of political and radical traditions of that folk song movement of the 1940s and 1950s that did take an issue in workers' rights, but had also addressed racism then in the 1940s and 1950s as well. Interestingly, he, together with Joan Baez, as you can see there, sang one of his songs, or two of his songs actually, but one of them was When the Ship Comes In, at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington in 1963. Now that March on Washington is very famous, of course, for the speeches, and in particular, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But in addition to all the different speeches that were given at that demonstration, so too were lots of songs sung by different artists of the day. Artists from the white folk movement, the white folk music movement, but in addition, gospel singers, and others from the African American musical tradition as well. So I think it's very interesting that there are as many songs as there are speeches at that demonstration, a very famous demonstration in Washington in 1963. Now, this matter of genre is very, very important. It's something that we give attention to on the module, because different genres are different and draw upon different traditions and involve different political decisions being made as well. So a new kind of genre of African American music that comes to prominence from about the mid-1960s onwards is, of course, funk music. And one of the pioneers of that funk music was James Brown. I'm sure he's familiar to you. I mean, his songs can be heard very, very frequently, can't they? He is, an absolute giant of African American musical culture and indeed politics during that time. He was involved in different initiatives on the part of the Black Panther Party, for example. Well, funk is interesting as a genre because if music is made up of harmony, melody and rhythm, well, Brown and other pioneers of funk made a conscious decision to prioritise rhythm over melody and harmony. And in this, they were drawing upon the greater emphasis placed upon rhythm within African musical traditions. So here was a very definite political decision then to pioneer a new style of music in order to pay tribute to African musical cultures and traditions. So that was a very political kind of decision being made at that time, and therefore provides us another way in which to interpret music then on a different kind of level. So another quick kind of experiment here then. We can understand songs, can't we, through their lyrics. All sorts of different kinds of messages are being conveyed there within the lyrics of songs. This is one of the most famous of James Brown's songs during the 1960s, and one that, apparently and perhaps quite clearly reflects the kind of black pride of that time. Now, we can read those words and we can get a sense of the message intended by James Brown. But one of the points on the module that I teach is that, well, we don't necessarily consume songs in this way, do we? We listen to them. They are an aural product. They are communicated by sound. And indeed, in the performance of that song, in the musical accompaniment that goes with it, all manner of other aspects of meaning are added to the song that enhance the messages being conveyed through the words. So again, I just want to play a short excerpt from this song to see what you think. On the one hand, read the words. On the other hand, listen to the performance. Ask yourself the degree to which the performance itself adds meaning to this song.
We've been built and we've been scorned. We've been treated bad, talked about, as sure as you born. But just as sure as it takes 2 eyes to make a pair, brother, we can't quit until we get our share. Say it loud. Say it loud. One more time. Say it loud. I've worked on jobs with my feet in my hand.
Just a short clip of that. So what do you think of that then?
Ashton says a song like this talking about experiencing racism could have easily been very sad. So I think it's important how joyous the performance is, celebrating what it meant to him to be proud of his culture. And another comment from Krat, adds positivity and passion to the music. Spreads an uplifting message.
Those are very, very interesting observations. It does project, doesn't it, confidence and pride. and optimism in many ways.
Comment here from Nia about the aspect of call of response.
Yeah.
And Sarah's struck by the contrast with something like Strange Fruit, for example.
Call and response is really interesting, isn't it? Call and response, again, is a characteristic of African oral cultures and then subsequently African American oral cultures. We can think of a black preacher, can't we, in a black church, calling and then being answered by his congregation. In which a sense of community is built, in which the speaker and then the congregation engage and create this kind of sermon together in exactly the same kinds of ways that James Brown and his instrumentalists were calling and responding to each other. It creates a sense of community, a sense of unity, a sense of togetherness. And so again, it was an active decision then. A conscious decision to draw upon a distinctive aspect of African American culture. And showcase it then, foreground it in this cultural production. So yes, absolutely spot on and really, really important. So something else we can observe then in relation to listening then and to understanding a little better. Those kinds of songs might be described as protest songs, of course. A very explicit and clear political message is being conveyed through the song. But there are other ways in which songs can be political, even if there is no explicit kind of reference to particular campaigns, particular movements, and so on. So just as funk came to prominence during those 1960s, so too did another genre of African American music, soul music. And this again drew upon black traditions, African American traditions then, and can be considered as declarations of black pride. So Aretha Franklin, for example, one of those, the giants of the soul music genre of the 1960s, drawing upon particular African American traditions, and in particular the gospel vocal, declaring its importance, declaring its worth and its value, asserting the importance of this particular African American tradition and singing about it with pride and with evident enjoyment. So again, we can consider the apparently mere love songs of Aretha Franklin as something very, very political indeed. As you can see there, an African American magazine, Ebony, stated in that year that the summer of 1967 was the summer of Aretha, rap and revolt. And there it's referring to Aretha Franklin and her soul music, H. Rap Brown, one of the leaders of the Black Panthers, and revolt then, disturbances in the urban towns and cities of America during the long hot summer of that year. So joining those things together then is a clear kind of indication of what people considered to be the significance of soul music at that time. Just to bring things towards an end, some historians talk about some sort of rise and fall of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. They see a period of optimism in the 50s and early 1960s, certain kinds of victories, legislation being passed, perhaps Kennedy's government and certainly Johnson's government then being a little more supportive of calls for racial justice than were governments previously. But they also argue that the movement achieved some sort of high point in those middle of the 1960s and then suffered some sort of decline. Divisions appear within the movement between non-violence and militancy. Black nationalism comes to the fore, perhaps in some ways. The authorities suppress the movement to a very significant degree. Vietnam War and the peace movement takes a lot of the energy of the movement to some degree. And of course, leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are murdered. And so there's that loss of leadership. So for these kinds of reasons then, and a few others, there's this idea of a decline or a fall then in the civil rights movement in the second half of the 1960s and into the 1970s. And this apparently reflected in the music. So one historian, Mark Anthony Neal, for example, he points to the music of Sly and the Family Stone. He points out the buoyant optimism of their album released in 1969, Stand, and contrasts that with the pessimism and the very sort of dark sound of there's a riot going on just 2 years later. And the content matter of those songs are of a very different character to that previous album. In addition, lots of historians of this culture, of that movement, point out to the increasingly nationalist political content and indeed pessimism of this kind of new genre of music in the early 1970s, this sort of proto-rap. Gil Scott-Heron is the most obvious example of that, but then The Last Poets, a group of poets and rappers then from New York, similarly convey a very different kind of message to the beloved community of Martin Luther King and non-violence and the gospel kind of movement of the 1950s and 1960s. So there's that there as well. Okay then, I'll bring things to a close now. This is a last kind of observation that we might want to reflect upon within the discussion. And this sort of point that, you know, as it's the commercial kind of music industry that starts taking up these kinds of issues, as it's these commercial artists that start singing about the Black protest movement, that perhaps we can discern some sort of commodification of Black protest in that period, whereby radical politics and protest politics is made into a commodity to be bought and to be sold in albums and on singles. Now, is that true? Does music that is created and then sold commercially, is it less radical than other types of musical culture? Is this, you know, is the kind of protest declarations of these artists, are these just intended to sell more copies, sell more albums, sell more music, rather than genuinely trying to make some sort of political declaration and change people's minds?
I'm just going to spin back to a previous question that came up earlier, if that's all right. Brian, he asked earlier when we were talking about songs with the basis in the Labour movement. He asked why did they frequently use songs from the Labour movement specifically? What was it about those songs that became part of the protesters?
I think in the first place, there's a very long tradition of songs being utilised within the Labour movement. So we can go back to the 19th century in a British or European context, for example. We can see songs being important within the early trade union movement. We can see it important in Chartism. We can see songs as being important to socialists and other revolutionaries in Europe in the 1830s and 1840s. Then being utilised in the late 19th century by labour movements at that time, drawing upon those older song traditions. Socialists in Britain, for example, they were publishing these collections of songs drawn from the last century or so in those kinds of ways, and songs continue to be used to a very significant degree into the first half of the 20th century within labour movements as well, including in America, and so in some ways it is a reservoir of songs to be drawn upon. In addition, though, you can say that certain individuals within the labour movement, they were interested in matters of racial justice as well in the 1930s and 1940s. The communists most definitely were, and the communists took a very instrumental attitude towards songs. They did draw upon them, they did write them, they did publish them and perform them in order to advance different political objectives, including civil rights. So in some ways, those kinds of connections were there in America between the labour movement and civil rights in the 30s and 40s that continued to influence things into the 1950s then. And in some ways, I guess labour movement songs are quite general, aren't they? Hoping for a better day, for justice and freedom for all. Those kinds of things are easily adaptable then to this other context of the civil rights movement.
Thanks, Steve. A couple of comments speaking to your question at the end of the presentation. Nia's saying, doesn't making music a commodity water the protest down? Bob Marley, she cites, for instance.
Very difficult answer, isn't it? An artist, him or herself, will say, well, no, I really do genuinely and truly believe these things. These are important matters and I wish to address them through my music. But then you can imagine ways in which those things appeal, those kinds of features within songs can be very appealing. They can make them more saleable. You can, if they're in some ways controversy attracts attention and possibly more sales or more plays on the radio and so on. So I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, looking around today, what types of artists do you listen to? To what extent are they commenting upon political matters or social issues? Do you think that they genuinely believe those kinds of things and are performing a useful role in highlighting them in their music? Or are they quite cynically playing a game in order to increase sales? I mean, I mentioned lots of artists in our first slide or two. Beyonce is one that's very high profile and has been addressing these political issues in the last few years. What motivates her to do so?
Interesting comment here. Rebecca says, do you think that the fact that a lot of the music industry is white, I presume you mean the management of the music industry and the leadership of it, makes the music more palatable, less palatable, and pick and choose what messages are told?
That certainly goes on, doesn't it? It can be seen to have gone on in those 1950s, 60s and 70s. Certainly in the 60s and 70s as the music becomes more radical. People like Gil Scott-Heron, the Last Poets, these were militant individuals with very strong kinds of messages who were damning in their critiques of the situation at that time. And so were not picked up by the big labels and were never likely to be picked up by the big labels. They tended to be published on smaller independent labels, for example, who were willing to take those kinds of risks. Kind of connected kind of issue to that, the matter of Motown is very, very interesting. Berry Gordy, the black owner of this black business, was very wary of kind of political music during the 1960s. Tended to veer away from it and wanted to create this apparently apolitical, enjoyable, optimistic, popular music for broader crossover and greater sales. And, there are these kinds of disagreements between himself then and some of his artists into the 1970s. So Stevie Wonder, for example, wanting to comment on these kinds of things, wanting artistic independence in order to address these things and facing some sort of pushback from Berry Gordy. Marvin Gaye similarly, but nevertheless gaining that ability to produce these albums. But Motown and Berry Gordy are quite interesting because they did do a number of recorded spoken word albums. So, for example, Motown attended the March on Washington and recorded Martin Luther King's speech. Now, they didn't use it much. They didn't sell it a great deal in the 1960s, but I understand they're about to release a remastered version of that Motown recording of Martin Luther King's speech. So that's just about to be made available. But it's interesting that they did not, put it out to any great degree at that time. I think there were bootleg copies, but it wasn't widely available at that time.
Do you think that musicians like Sly Stone intentionally tried to show people the darkness of the time with albums like There's a Riot, or was it something that they did accidentally just as a result of the darker time?
Yeah, I think it's Mark Anthony Neal that writes about those albums and sort of tracks the different sounds, the different feel of those albums over time and tries to connect them to broader kind of developments in the civil rights movement. So as I mentioned, he does see this kind of optimism in the 60s being replaced by this pessimism in the 70s, and therefore uses it as a means to plot this apparent fall of the civil rights movement. As he also points out, there are things going on in Sly Stone's personal life at that time. There's all sorts of tensions within the band. Sly Stone himself is suffering as a result of his drug addiction. And so these kind of personal considerations and these different, the particular atmosphere within the band itself is having an influence then on the types of topics addressed in their songs, in addition to the types of sounds that they are making to accompany those sounds at that time. So, we have to think of all these things in their totality. We have to think of all the different possible influences on any piece of music that is being produced and the role of a great many different individuals apart from just the artist in order to properly contextualize any musical source, any song as a primary historical source. And then how do we attach significance and importance to these different considerations leading to the production of these songs? That is one of the methodological issues that faces us as historians as we're trying to think about songs as a primary historical source, and they certainly face us when we're thinking about Sly Stone then, and those songs through the late 60s and early 1970s as well. So thank you very much for the question, the comment. It's an interesting thing to consider, isn't it? What exactly is at work here?
Any final thoughts from you, Steve? Maybe some thoughts about the wider course that you're a part of at Aberystwyth?
Just that, yes, I mean, as I mentioned, I am a modern historian, but the department does have historians from medieval through early modern and into late modern. We try to offer as broad a kind of curriculum as possible, and so there is material on Welsh history, British history, European, North American and Asian history as well. So have a look at the website, have a look at the types of courses, modules that we offer, see if something takes your fancy there. And feel free to get in touch with myself, of course, or indeed our admissions tutor in the department. There's lots of information available on the website, but we can provide you with answers to particular queries that you might have as well. So feel free to get in touch with us.